Okay, so yeah, I guess you were a lockdown diagnosis during the pandemic. So when were you first diagnosed and kind of what was happening in your life? What were some of the signs that made you first think maybe this is ADHD?
So I was diagnosed last summer. So that would be, I think, 2020 during lockdown. But actually, I've been researching it and looking into it for a little while because somebody who I work with, someone who works for me, in fact, had said, I've just read this book about ADHD. I think I've got it, and I think you've got it too. And I was a little bit offended, which I'll come on to why in a sec. But I was a bit what? Because before I do what I do now, I'm an entrepreneur now, but I was a journalist and then I was a teacher. And I've worked with loads of kids with ADHD, the classic boy bouncing around the classroom. I didn't really know much about it. And I was a bit like, what? Like, why would you say that? But I went off and read this book that she recommended. And actually, I can't remember what book it was, but the first line is something like, you probably won't read all of this book because you've got ADHD, which I didn't. But I read the first part of it and I thought, oh. So I just started looking into it. And I certainly had always had this feeling throughout my life that I was different, that I didn't operate in the way that other people did. And a lot of it was around my kind of tenaciousness and my drivenness, and like I was a massive workaholic, whatever I was doing. And I couldn't understand why other people weren't driven in the same way, why they weren't like waking up in the middle of night thinking about work, why they didn't like holidays, or like why they like, why I didn't like holidays, I should say, why I struggled to switch off, like why I found weekends hard, why I found it hard to take time off, why I just was driven all the time to be kind of working and achieving. I also had these question marks from childhood around why I was really, really good at some stuff, but really bad at other things. So I was really good at English, history, music, things that I was interested in. And I mean, like really good, but terrible at things that I wasn't interested in. I had this growing sense as I was a child that I was much cleverer than people gave me credit for. And I don't know really where I got that from. Um, but my report cards were right the way through school, top marks for things that I liked and was good at, and scraping the barrel at other things. So there was this kind of drivenness and this kind of like I just felt like I couldn't switch off the whole time, like weekends, evenings. I was always thinking about projects. I was always like wanting to get back to my desk all the time. I found holidays really hard. Weekends, I can be in a terrible state because the time's not structured. I don't know what to do with myself. I feel guilty about not being productive all the time. Also struggling with day-to-day stuff. So like, how can I launch a really successful online business but not be able to pay a bill, or not be able to um not be able to I don't know, remember somebody's birthday, or remember to say thank you to somebody who sent me a present, or I was always getting late payments. And so it's, how could I be so high achieving and so productive in some ways, but then also so, well, just a bit of a mess in other areas. So the more I started to read about all of this stuff and start to bring it all together, and I started to research about ADHD, and I started to think, oh, maybe that could be me. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And even the initial sense of feeling insulted, I think I relate to that as well because I've talked about this on the podcast. Like my therapist was sort of gently suggesting for a few years to me that I should look into it. And there was that sort of sense of like, when you haven't looked into it, especially as a grown woman, you have these misconceptions and there is so much of that underlying stigma in terms of like, do you view me as a chaotic mess? Because I work really, really hard to seem like I'm together and not really putting together the pieces, which is like, no, the point is you are really together and you feel like a hot mess. It's almost like the reverse.
Yeah, and I think there was another stage in life that it really started to come up was when I had my daughter. So my daughter's now, um, she just turned 16. But I'd always wanted to be a mum, and I was desperate to have children and had quite a lot of problems having children. But then when my daughter turned up, and she did turn up, she was very premature, so it was quite stressful. But when she did turn up, I was like, "Oh, so this is what it's like. Like, why is it boring? Why does everybody else seem to be really enjoying this where I'm like at home feeling trapped in this mess of sterilizing bottles and making baby food, and everybody else seems to be really happy. Everybody else seems to be really enjoying this lifestyle. Like, are they all lying? Is everybody having a great time and I'm not?" That was another point for me as well. And at the time, I was like, work was just, it was my escape. It was just like, oh wow, I can go off. I was working as a freelance journalist at the time. I can go off and just work in my office for a couple of hours. That was like the best thing ever. And I think it was those times as well, and realizing that I wasn't like other women. I struggled to keep on top of all the different jobs in the house. And again, as I started to research and read all the books, and I started, that was quite common. Like, other people seem to be able to keep on top of their laundry and keep their kids clean and put a healthy meal on the table every week or whatever, at every day, I should say. And yeah, I just was I felt like an alien. I felt really different to other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, bringing up your daughter, I remember you talked about that in your, I think maybe it was both the interview and your own episode, about that feeling of like feeling like you should have gratitude for being a mother. And yes, I mean, like, being a mother is a wonderful thing. I'm grateful for it. I love my children. And yet at the same time, there really is this feeling of like, why can I not be present with my children? Um, and now realizing, being present is something that's really difficult for us. So yeah, I really, really related to that feeling of like, why am I not enjoying this as much as I feel like I should be?
Yeah,
And
and playing with children, like, other people seem to enjoy playing with children. I'm like, I can only enjoy this if there's a purpose. So, like baking or craft where there's an end goal, and I don't even like craft because I've got no patience with fiddly things. But like this playing on the floor with dolls, and like there's no end goal, there's no purpose to this. So this is really hard. And I had to really steel myself to say, I am going to play for half an hour, and I am going to try and be in the moment and not think about all the other things that I could be doing. But everybody else seemed to be finding it fine and getting on just fine with it.
Mhm. Now, did things change for you in the pandemic where you felt like I really need to get this taken care of?
I think it was the kind of the sort of drivenness around my work and my business, I think. And I think that came more to the fore in the pandemic because there was more time to work, if you like. So not being able to go out and mix with people, not being forced to do things and go to things in the same way. Suddenly weekends became even more difficult because the temptation just to sit and work and to try and achieve became more and more and more. There was no excuse not to do it. And I was kind of thinking, this isn't healthy at all. Like, I should be wanting to do things in the house, or I should be wanting to create things or decorate the house or whatever. But it was just like I was just driven and driven and driven. And I wouldn't say that I became, I don't know, more anxious, or I maybe I even had more time to think about things because I had less time, more time to think and less time to talk to other people or be with other people. Um, yeah, I just, yeah, maybe it was more of that time and space. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, it was really this sense that I was like generating ideas on hyperdrive during the pandemic, I think because there was so much downtime. And yet I didn't have the ability to follow through on anything because my kids were home and my husband was home. And so my space was invaded. And I always felt like I had to be kind of on call, especially with remote learning. Like it just felt like there was some some, emergency with Zoom or Wi-Fi or something at all. I had to be kind of always have one ear listening for one of my children. So I couldn't do anything. And so it was that pull between like having all these ideas and wanting to be productive, and yet also sort of feeling like I spent a lot of time just sitting, waiting, and not being able to start any projects. And that's when I sort of really felt like I was like, that's when I started to have the emotional breakdown, which was just like, God, I can't live like this. And that's when I realized rage was a big part of ADHD.
Yeah, it's the pandemic was, I remember being absolutely panicked by it because I thought that I thought I would never be able to get used to it, because for me, being able to go out and do what I want to do when I want to do it is a big thing. I actually adapted better than I thought. But I remember being absolutely terrified and sending a friend a message saying, I just don't know how I'm going to cope with not being able to go out and move. And what if they say that we can't, in some countries they were saying that you couldn't even exercise outside of your house, which that was just the worst thing ever. So I started going out at 5 o'clock every day, and I was either listening to, that was when our government briefing was on at 5 o'clock every day, which is probably the most depressing thing in the world. I was either listening to to the briefing from the government, or I was listening to ADHD podcasts and swatting up on that. But it was I actually hesitated. It took me ages to work up the courage to get to even approach a psychotherapist, because also I kind of come from the kind of family, that's a whole interesting topic in itself, I think, is about ADHD being classed as a mental health issue, whereas I'd personally always seen it as a neurodiversity. And because I hadn't suffered from any mental health issues myself, it was, the two felt quite different. So this idea of going to a psychotherapist like felt like a big thing for me, because it's something that I'd never done before. And then when I got in touch, finally, having done lots of research to get this appointment, they came back to me and said, okay, right, well, we need to speak to one of your parents. I was like, what?
You're
um,
45 at this point, right?
yeah, we need to speak to somebody who, was part of your life when you were growing up. And I was like, I can't do that. That will upset my parents. Like, I
Mhm.
cannot. But what I said in my reply probably prompted her to come back and say, we'll assess you anyway. So I said, well, the reason I can't is because I have a sibling who, although not diagnosed, displays very, very hyperactive symptoms as a child. And I'm the good kid. Like, we've got our hyperactive sibling who was in trouble or whatever, but I'm the good kid. Like, they're not going to get this at all. Like, if my sibling said that they were being assessed for ADHD, they'd be totally on board with that. But me, no, no, no. So I kind of, but, and I think, when you say, can I be assessed for ADHD? And actually I have a sibling who, from how I described it, undiagnosed, but probably has it too. And I kind of betrayed myself and gave myself away, but I was terrified. And I got my school reports. I asked my mum for them, but I didn't say what they were for, because I just couldn't even go there, because I knew it wouldn't be understood and it would worry them. I just thought, "Ugh, I can't do that." So I almost backed out of the diagnosis because I didn't want my parents to be involved in it at all. Which at 45 is quite yeah, it's being that worried at that age is probably quite silly.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how many women I've interviewed who were the good kid, who had a sibling that exhibited the more stereotypical symptoms, and they were the good kid, and how that kind of led to the anxiety, of needing to be less problematic, or like not wanting to disrupt things, and leads to, so many of us have that people pleasing element to our personality. And to think about how the sort of comorbidities of people pleasing and anxiety just kind of foster and foster and foster throughout your life, as not only are you struggling, but then you can't even express that because you don't have the words to articulate the ways in which you're struggling, but also you're not supposed to be the one who struggles.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I spent most of my childhood obviously not conscious of it at the time, but trying to achieve to get myself noticed in a way, because having a sibling who, like I say, hasn't been diagnosed, but I would say, you know, is pretty dead cert, would you know, they were very preoccupied with what he was doing and what he was getting up to, and quite rightly so, because there was usually something going on. But I think part of my overachieving was to do with, hey, look at me, I've got something to add. I'm valuable, I'm good, like I'm good at, I'm not good at everything, but I'm really really good at some things. And I don't think that's probably a healthy pattern. And I think with a ADHD brain, you just take everything further than further than the next person, if that makes sense.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I'm sort of dealing with that with my own children in terms of the way I notice that as parents, it's so easy to fall into those like categorizations, right? Like you're the good one, you're the easy one, you're the one who gets straight A's, you're the one who messes up. And like I see it through looking back in my own life how problematic that was, that my parents did that to my brothers and to me, and how that kind of really shaped who my view of myself. And as you know, as I was the poor student, and I had a very similar sense to you, which was like, no, I realize I'm bright, I just can't show it in any meaningful way. And so yeah, like it's, I really sort of as a parent now have to keep that in check a lot of the time, of like placing these kind of labels on my children and realizing how what
Mm.
that does to you as you grow up.
Mm.
Now it's interesting looking at your CV is very ADHD, right? I mean, you, I think when you look up like best jobs for people with ADHD, journalist and teacher both show up on that list. And as a former journalist, it makes complete sense to me. I loved working in newspapers. I loved deadlines. You know, the first time in my life that I ever really felt like I was excited about anything was when I joined the newspaper at university. And I was just like so motivated. And I just loved this room full of snarky, you know, underachieving bastards who chain smoked and, you know, and drank copious amounts of coffee. And like, it was just, you know, they were my people. I just loved it so much. And I loved that pressure. Um, and I really thought it was interesting that you talked about how teaching, there were so many elements to teaching that weren't ADHD friendly, like the mundane tasks of having to remember and keep track of things. And, you know, I get how teaching can be very uh, you know, a lot of people with ADHD end up teaching because you're on your feet and you have, you know, things change and you have these one-on-one interpersonal relationships. But I hadn't thought about all of the underlying stuff like marking grading papers and you know, the repetition.
Mm. Yeah, so the things I loved about teaching were those things that you just mentioned there. So being on your feet, like the idea of having a job where you have to go and sit at the same desk for weeks on end, like just doesn't appeal to me. So I liked that. And it was interesting. I work with teenagers, they're quite challenging, every day is different. But I remember we used to have to fill out our teacher's planner every year, which is quite ironic because I now have a planner and I sometimes think about that when I'm using it. But and it used to fill me with this sense of dread, because I used to think, oh, I'm going to be in this classroom at the same time with this same group of kids for the rest of the year. Sometimes you might have a 2 week timetable, so there might be a little bit of variation, but generally I'm going to be here with these kids, maybe teaching them Macbeth instead of Much Ado About Nothing or something, but I'm going to be here doing this thing. And that used to fill me with dread. But the other thing that I found really hard, and maybe my perception of it is worse than it is, I was thinking about this, whether I felt that my colleagues thought badly of me, and maybe they didn't even, but I felt badly of myself because I could never get a set of books back in. So for me, the hardest thing was, say if you had 30 Macbeths and you give them out, and the idea that like you'd be able to record all the numbers of the books because they were numbered in the right part of your register, and then get it back off the child without losing it was just like the hardest thing in the world. Or filling out the and I remember getting a few eye rolls and a few raised eyebrows about my books. It might well be that I perceived myself as being worse than other people, or being chased up because I'd lost paperwork. I was maybe I was better than I thought I was, but I certainly felt that that was where my inadequacy showed up. Like, I was a good classroom teacher and I was very diligent, but also I had no control over my workload, which is kind of like I just couldn't. Teaching's hard, and you talk to any teacher and they'll say, well, you're busy all day and then you go home and you have to plan your lessons and mark books and it's hard. But they didn't seem to be up till like 2 o'clock in the morning like I was, hard, or they didn't seem to be working every weekend. Like, they seemed to be able to get it done in, long hours, but not the same as me. So yeah, there were a few things about teaching. Generally, I liked it, but I was heading for burnout at a very young age, which was why I decided to move over to journalism.
Yeah, because journalism won't burn you out.
Yeah. Well, the thing I like about journalism, or I liked, or was that you were generally working on one thing at a time. So I say that, but you might be working on 4 stories at a time, but there would come that time where you would go, right, I've got to write this, the deadline's at this time. I've got to pull all of my notes together and I'm just focusing on this one thing, and then I will move on to the next few things. But there were always these points in the week where you just put your head down and you had to work to the deadline. And I was used to, because I taught journalism as well. I was a journalism lecturer at a few universities in the UK. And I used to say to my students, if you were the kind of kid that got your homework done at the last minute, but did it well, like journalism, you'll do well in journalism, because you have to be able to hold your nerve that you can leave it to the last minute, because the news doesn't kind of conveniently happen at times that fit in with your deadlines. Like, you have to be able to pull out all the stops and produce a good piece of work, even if you're not feeling creative or inspired, or you just have to be able to do it and do a high quality piece of work right at the last minute. And that did suit me, and I liked the adrenaline, and I also liked things like getting shouted at by by MPs, by politicians, or like even like people putting the phone down on me, or like there was a certain amount of excitement. And you know celebrities, like managing to get an interview with a celebrity that you didn't think you'd ever be able to get, or a politician, or being being on the phone and somebody giving you that killer line that you think, oh my god, or did they realize they just said that, because that's just going to be such a great story. There was a hell of a lot of adrenaline in that, I think. And yeah, I can see you're smiling. You know exactly what I mean. But it's a high low, high low, high low. I used to have a lot of neck pain, a lot of problems, because I was like, I was hunched over my
Yeah,
computer, tense all the time, which I don't get now, even though I spend a lot of time at my computer. But I think it was because there were deadlines and deadlines. I was often so close to the wire that,
absolutely. And you
yeah,
would be holding in your bladder for hours
yeah.
at end. It's funny. I actually, yeah, um, I loved all of that. I actually sort of went from writing. I started out writing, reporting, and writing and editing, and moved into the design elements, page design and art direction. And again, it was the same, of like putting together the front page and all the different puzzle pieces of layout that I ended up loving and doing more of, and more of the copy editing, the headline writing, and small copy, because I felt like that was even less pressure than writing the article. But I loved working at small papers where you had to do everything, where it was like all of these little bits and all of these different plates, and everything was coming together. And then finally, deadline would hit at, midnight, and everything would go, and it would go off, and you'd let out a big exhale, and then you could go home with a clean slate and start again in the morning. And one of the like most boring jobs I ever had was at the most prestigious newspaper I worked at, which was the Wall Street Journal, because everybody did one job, and you had to do that one job really, really well, and you had to wait for everybody else to do their job before you could do your job. And it was just the most boring job ever. I mean, it's the first thing I always talk about because I'm like, oh yeah, I worked there. But it was my least favorite job in terms of being a newspaper designer, because I loved all the small places where you had to do everything. Yeah.
So, something that's come up for me recently, I've been thinking about this recently, is I used to fill in for an editor at The Guardian, and I used to upset people big time. And I'm really like, I think I'm quite an affable person, and quite a friendly person. But when I was editing on a newspaper, so sometimes they would be quite well known people, but they'd send their copy in, and then I'd say, thank you for that. I just need you to change X, Y, and Z. I don't quite get this bit. If you could just change that bit or whatever. And I used to say to myself, because these were often like Oxbridge educated, like a really intellectual men who were maybe not used to being addressed so directly, I now realized. And I used to just, I was very direct and used to say, look, this bit's great, but I need you to change this, this, and this. And I don't know if it was partly because I was like the supply teacher and they were playing me up, or it was I suspected it was because I was a woman, but my regular editor was a woman. But oh my God, my editor used to come back, she used to laugh and say, like, how many columnists have we lost this time? And I was just really direct. And I've only started to think about that in the last few years, because I think I'm actually really quite an emotionally intelligent person. I think I am quite aware of other people. But for me, it was just so straightforward. Like, I am in this job as the editor. My job is to give you feedback so we can get this to be the best possible article and get it on the page. So in that context, it seemed perfectly reasonable for me to just say how it was and just kind of say, this is what I need you to change. Could you change it? Oh, but people used to get so upset. And now reflecting on it, I do wonder whether there was a kind of neurodivergency about it, that in that context, I just couldn't, I've spoken to people about it since, and people have since said I'm very direct in giving feedback, but I I I I don't take offense to feedback if the context is I'm working for somebody and my job is to give them the best piece of content, whatever. I just take the feedback and I change it, and that's always how I worked as a writer. But I look back on that now and wonder whether I was very sort of neurodivergent about it, and I didn't appreciate that other people. I was very straightforward. I am a writer. I get feedback and I act on that feedback, whether I agree with it or not, or if I disagree with it, you know, I might talk about that. But ultimately, I know the editor is boss, and I have to do what they say. But I don't know if you can identify that with that, Katie. But
Oh,
I've only looked back at it now and like, oh, maybe I was just being really neurodivergent.
I feel like we could do an entire episode on like the etiquette of communication as a woman. Yeah, especially because I'm the same way. I'm like, cut to the chase. I remember a theater teacher of mine in high school said something that I still remember to this day, where she said, if something is really, really good, you have a lot of feedback and a lot of places where it could be better. If something's not very good, you have nothing to say about it. And so I always thought about that, yeah, when it came to editing pieces, right, where you would only give the editing part, and I would have to stop myself. But this was something I had to learn over time too, which was the same. I had the same issue, which was like I just was very brusque. People always complained that I was I didn't like pander to kind of that sense of validation. And in my mind, I'm sure they just called me a bitch. But I have to go back. I would always have to go back after I got all of the like criticism out of the way and kind of dumped that out. Then I would go back and start the email with like, here's what I loved. Great job on this, and I would actually have to like artificially put that in as a sense of like, warming them up for the criticism, because I got that exact same feedback from people. And I think it's the same even with the emails now, right? Where you have to go back and you have to look and be like, how many exclamation marks do I have? Do I have enough? Do I have too many? Do I sound crazy? And I think that that's like a very female situation, which is that kind of need to be likable and need to not sound overbearing. I don't think men have that same
Mm,
I don't think they self-edit in the same regard in terms of like how it's coming across. And then I
mm.
think there's also just sort of the nuances of the written word, right, where you have no idea. It sounds very lighthearted in my head, but then when somebody's reading it, they're like, wow, you're really just you're just really
Uh,
brusque.
I used to have people say things like, well, I've done as much work on it as I can now. And so I've spent 3 hours on it. I can't spend any more. And I would say things like, well, I can't publish this just to be nice, which was absolutely, I can't publish it just to be nice because you spent 3 hours on it. It's got to be it's got to be of the, in the right kind of shape for us to get it on the page. And I realize now that but in that kind of newspaper environment, when you're in deadline, part of it is about you don't have time to kind of give it. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but like a sort of shit sandwich type thing. But I'd be like, I can see through that. Like I can see through someone saying, well, this is lovely, but if you
Right.
could just change this, this, and this. So I'd just be like, this person's a professional. They're a writer. They're a columnist. Like I would imagine that it wouldn't even occur to me that they would need to have it sugar coated or whatever. But I realize now that might have, I was just so black and white about it. I think that's
Mhm.
what I'm getting at, is that it was this black and white thinking. And I used to often say that I thought that I think I was a really good editor. And I used to say, I used to joke that because I wasn't as clever as some of these Oxford Don type people, I was able to see where it was just fluff, like where it was just fluff and bluster, and I could just see and I'd be like, and I wasn't embarrassed to say I don't understand what that means. I don't think our readers will understand that. They say, oh well, it's the Guardian. And I was like, well, just because people read the Guardian, that doesn't mean that they have time to decode this very complex metaphor.
Mhm.
So so yeah, it was always the joke that I'd always lost half the columnists, and I think it was a little bit of being a woman, but also just being very straight talking and just far too black and white on that particular issue.
And now it seems like there's not a clear connection between being a journalist and being making planners and journals and diaries. But when you actually, it's quite a logical chain of events, right?
Yeah. So I kind of fell into entrepreneurship. And so basically, people would ask me, like, how do I get into The Guardian, or how do I get press coverage? So and I was getting this really nice lucrative consultancy work where people were paying me to go and teach them how to get press coverage, and thought, how can I get more of this? I know what I'll do. I'll start a blog. And then I started to think, okay, I've started this blog. How can I get more people to read it? So I started reading about that. And so I started learning about search engine optimization and email marketing and all this stuff. And then suddenly I was in this, oh, maybe I could make a business out of this. Maybe I could teach people about, initially it was press and PR and marketing. So I kind of fell into that. But yeah, so what happened was when I got into the entrepreneurial space, people were really struggling with content, and they was like, I don't know what to post. Like I don't know. Or I was looking at people's content and thinking, that's not very interesting. Like, why would you post that? That's really boring. And obviously I was learning about my own content. And as a journalist, obviously you have this innate sense of timing. So it's all about, my editor used to say to me, well, why would somebody need to hear about this now? Because as a journalist, you work from a calendar, and you'll know what I mean when I talk about on diary and off diary, I think. So on diary is events and things that are scheduled and coming up and you know about. So in the UK, that might be parliamentary debates or sort of key events, or sort of key select committee meetings or whatever, in the government. But then off diary is obviously breaking news, things that happen. So I had this real sense that you should only be talking about something. Like, so we talked earlier, didn't we, about my ADHD episode on my own podcast and how it's gone out. I've republished it today because it's ADHD Awareness Month. So it's this sense of timing. But I could see all these other people struggling around me, like with, I don't know what to publish when, and I don't, you know, and this just felt like the easiest thing in the world for me. So I was like, oh, okay. So in my usual sort of ADHD way, I thought, wouldn't it be really cool if I created this content planner that had all like awareness days and key dates and like prompts that would help people come up with content. So I got my designer to mock up a picture of what it would look like. And then I just sent an email to my email list and said, like, do you want to buy this? If you buy it now, you'll get it for, I think it was 19.50, the first one. But if you hang on until later, you'll pay more. And it was literally was just a test. It was like a very simple page that I created. Enough people bought it for me to validate the idea. And I thought, okay, that's good. So we made it. And I think the first time I did it, I had the idea in November, and we made it in November. And since then, so that was 5 years ago, I think it was, we've got a bit more sophisticated. But basically this planner that I created on the back of an envelope on a whim and just sold just to see what would happen has become like the kind of pivotal part of my business. So I now have this planner that I sell. I have a content planning event that we do every year, and I have a content planning membership as well. And the irony being is, like, I'm the worst planner in the world. Like, like I'm very consistent. and I had a podcast. I've got a podcast now. I had one that went for 450 episodes over 4 years and over 1 million downloads, and very consistent. But I'm not the best planner in the world, so I regularly laugh at myself, the fact that I've now got this whole business, this multi six-figure business around a planner, when I'm like the world's worst planner, basically.
Well, I think it's really understanding what structures you need, right? I mean, I think I forget my children exist when they're not home. So I have a reminder that says go pick up your kids, like I have to be I have reminders that pop up on my phone all day long for the simplest tasks because I know that I will forget them, right? And so I don't forget them because I have these reminders. So then am I a forgetful person or am I not a forgetful person? Because I've set up a structure that works for me so that I'm reminded constantly throughout the day. If I didn't have those, I wouldn't do any of those things. And so it's sort of, again, it's like sounds like you've set up this content creation planner, which does everything that you wouldn't normally think to do yourself. It's already sort of set up for you in a structure that works.
Well, I think it works for somebody who finds planning hard, which is how I came up with it. So I have this thing called overhead planning, which is a strange term, but anyway. I think what a lot of people do with content planning, or any kind of planning, is they do it in a very linear way. So they're like, okay, so I'm going to plan some content. I'm going to start on Monday, and then I'm going to do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then say they start in January. By the second week of January, they're like, oh, I'm all done with content planning. Like, this is awful, because it just feels too much. So I have always been able to look at the bigger picture. So I would look at my content planning. I would never start with what am I doing tomorrow or next week. I'd start with like next year. So for example, we're recording this in October 2021. I already know that next year I'm going to be launching my planner again in August 2022. I'm going to run an event in November. So I would start there. So I'd start like next year, and I'd be like, I'd divide my year into quarters, and I'd just start by just putting a few things. Okay, so I know that that planner is going to launch in August, and then in November I've got my event, and then I've got this happening. So that for me feels a lot less overwhelming, because you're just starting by looking at across your year, writing down a couple of things that are happening. And then, because this planner that I've created is all based around this content planning system, and then looking at it in quarters and just like breaking it down and saying, okay, well, what's going to be happening over the next few months, and putting like big picture ideas in there instead of the detail, because I really struggle with detail. So I'm great at coming up with. And the thing about this, when you run a business, and my clients for my planner, they're all business owners, is that that's how you sell more stuff. Like, if you can look next year, if I'm already thinking, oh, well, I'm launching my planner next August, so that means that I need to book in to get the branding done in next February, and it means I need to do a podcast episode on this, in 8 weeks time or whatever. My brain can totally do that, because it's not overwhelming, because it's not detailed, it's just big picture thinking. So then it's about breaking it down from quarters, and then every month I just sit down and look across the month and go, okay, right, what awareness days are going on? It's ADHD month. Maybe I'll put that podcast episode out again. And are there any sort of like fun days I can create content around? So for me, it's about just I always say it's like a videographer. So you take I'm actually doing it with my hands now, but you take like a wide shot of the year, and then you gradually get closer and closer. And I think if you're somebody who struggles with detail, as I do, that feels a lot less overwhelming. So I think I almost, without meaning to, created the planner that I wished somebody would create for me, that started big and wasn't about the detail, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me with my coaching um, online content, the biggest issue for me is remembering to post. And then once I remember to post, thinking, okay, what do I even have to say? I mean, I always have a million things to say. It's just a matter of like, what's the one thing I'm going to focus on today? And so, yeah, I mean, what I want is somebody to tell me today's, Monday you post this, Tuesday you
Yeah.
post this, right? And then even
Yeah.
better,
Yeah.
have someone else to post it for me. uh, but it's the same, like it's that same idea of like, yeah, you I think so many small businesses run into that with social media, which is just the mundanity of mundanity. That sounds weird. Anyway, how mundane it is to post over and oh, the fact that people need to see messages over and over and over again. I create a thing, I post about it once, and then I don't understand why nobody comes flocking to the thing. It's
Yeah.
where I'm like, do I really have to post about this every day? Do I really, like, is that really what it's come down to? We just need to be hit over the head over and over and over again. And as a consumer, the answer is yes, absolutely.
Well, the other thing was that everybody was always saying to me, I just wish somebody could tell me what to post, like when. So, like, 'cause
Mm,
exactly what you were saying there. But the problem with that is that obviously we have to create content that's for art, like working on newspaper. Like, if you work in a newspaper, you have to create content for the audience of that newspaper and what they're interested in. And if you create content that you're only interested in or that would be better suited to another audience, it's not going to land. So unfortunately, what most people want is they want templates. They want you to kind of just say, "Hey, just post this, and here you go." But actually, then an ADHD brain would get really bored with that anyway. But so I've been working probably like for the last 5 years to make this planner better and better, and I I kept mulling that over in my head the whole time. It's like, so people want me to tell them what to post where and when. I can't do that because that's not going to help them get sales, and they're going to get it off their to-do list, but they're not going to get sales. And then I came up with this thing this year, which I call the 4x4 strategy, which is just basically, I kind of came to the conclusion by working with so many people that most people post too much anyway. And like, if all of us just showed up 4 days a week and posted something like 4 days out of 7, that's, yeah, and we did it consistently, with the odd week, or sometimes I have times where I don't want to post, then that will be a lot better than what a lot of people do. Is I call it yo-yo content creation. It's like yo-yo dieting, where you like start on a Monday and then by Wednesday you're totally cheesed off. So I came up with this 4x4 strategy, 4 stars of content, 4 days a week. It's really easy to remember. That's what I was thinking as well. How could I share something with somebody that's like really easy to remember? 4 stars of content, 4 days a week. And my planner has evolved, and that's really what it's about. But it comes from that whole thing about just wanting to make it easier and just to break it down smaller and smaller. And I think I picked this up when I was a teacher as well, about m- most of us need frameworks or templates, or not templates to copy, but almost like, I call them like your bicycle stabilizers kind of thing. But if you can give somebody like a template to follow the first few times they do it, I've got these 4 stars of content, but people might decide that actually they only want to do one of them, and that's fine. But showing up and doing that because you know how to do that is better than not showing up at all. And there were lots of other things that inspired me. This is where the crazy places that my brain goes. But I was thinking about, those water bottles that you can buy where it tells you how much water you should drink over the day.
mhm.
And I was thinking, how could I how could I turn that into content plan to help with content planning? So this year in the planner, we've actually got little bits that you can tick off, just, so that you've done your 4 days for accountability. So you can say, oh, I can color in the little circles and tick them off and say, like, I've done my four days this week. Actually, I've done 5. So like brownie points for me. And so, yeah, it's really evolved, this planner. And I kind of laugh and say that I'm like the worst person in the world to start a planner because I'm really disorganized and struggle with detail. But in a way, what's evolved is something that does work for people who struggle with detail, because you could literally, with 4 stars of content 4 days a week, you could open up your planner and just post spontaneously every day. It's not like, if that works for you, if that kind of makes sense. So I think there is method in the madness of me having a planner, I think.
Oh no, absolutely. I love it. I'm sold. But now, on a more broad spectrum, in terms of, if you're not a content creator, if you're just sort of a mom and a partner and a woman trying to get through your day, why do we continually collect calendars and planners and can't seem to ever feel organized? I mean, I feel like there's that sense of needing to be organized is something that eludes us. I think just because of the level of chaos in our brains, I think we're just never going to feel settled the way that, like you said, like, we're never going to feel relaxed on vacation. We're never going to feel relaxed on the weekends. It's just a certain, like, base level of chaos that we kind of have to live with and forgive. But I'm curious, when you talk about the love-hate relationship with planners, why what's falling apart there?
Well, this is really interesting. Selling a planner has been really interesting for me because I think our problem with planners isn't the planners. It's our it's us thinking that to get value out of a planner, we have to write in it or use it every day. And actually, I've created a lot of content about this. So objection content for selling my planner is actually I I sell this planner. The funniest thing, and I don't really write in mine that much, but I do use it. But to get value out of a planner or some kind of planning tool, where did we get the idea that we have to use it every single day and we have to I think it's like everything that we buy, we think it's only valuable to us. So I find myself saying to clients a lot, like, y I've got clients who never write a thing in this planner. I've got some that write in every single bit, but why does everybody want to be that person who writes in every single bit? Because we're not all like that. Some people just use it as a reference. They look up these awareness days. Some people, they might use it to plan out a project in it. There might be, but if they get value from that bit, and I've personally come to the conclusion that our problem with planners isn't the planners themselves. It's that we think we have to use them in a certain way, and and that's where all the problems come, is the fact that we're putting pressure on ourselves to think, I buy a planner and it's only valuable if I use it in this certain way. And I use it every single year and I
Mhm.
don't pick it up and put it down. And I certainly don't use planners like that. I don't know about you.
No, I mean, this is something I feel like this is a theme I come back to a lot in my interviews, which is like, we value consistency in such a way because we were told our entire lives that we were inconsistent and that we needed to be more consistent, from school to jobs, and there are a lot of hidden costs in inconsistency. We tend to have lower salaries because we don't keep jobs as long, or, if you're constantly paying money for these things that you only use for a month or two, you feel like that's money down the drain, right? And so there are ways in which we feel like there are these sort of financial taxes on who we are as with ADHD. But I think at the same time, like, yeah, I think there's value in that's being placed in consistency is misguided, because I think we don't place enough value in using what works, right? And yeah, so this planner worked for you for this project, or this amount of time, and you needed to move on. That's great. You're learning more. This is
Yeah, yeah,
information. That
yeah,
this you shouldn't have to be the person who is consistent all the time. But
yeah.
what
And I
somehow
think,
we feel like there's like we're faulty for not being consistent because we've been told
yeah,
that our whole lives.
yeah. And I help people with things like, so starting podcasts or whatever. And so, like, who says that you have to have a podcast and you launch it and then you have to have it forever? Like, what's wrong with just doing 6 or 8 episodes, or doing a blog for six blog and then having a break or whatever? Like, who's to say that the right way to do it is to do it forever and a day? Like, who's to say that you couldn't say, I find social media hard, so I'm just going to really go for it 1 week a month, and then I'm going to chill out for the rest of the month and come back to it. If you can find a way that, I think it's about finding a way. I think the trouble is we're always trying to fit ourselves into other people's way of doing it. And for me, the things that work the best are the most simple things. So for example, I worked out accidentally quite a few years ago that I need uninterrupted blocks of time to get things done. I mean, don't we all? So I stopped having meetings in the morning, and it makes me sound like a real princess or a real like prima donna. Like, I don't take meetings in the morning, but I don't. So before 12 o'clock, unless it's really, really important, I don't have any meetings. And everyone knows in my team, my clients know that I don't do meetings, because if I if I'm on and off Zoom, on and off all day meetings, like, I just a normal person can't get, so say a normal person, but someone with a normal brain can't get things done. So I think it's about being a bit kinder to ourselves and finding those simple things that work. And I've sometimes said to clients, so they'll say, well, I did learn this one thing from getting your planner, and actually I do that thing all the time. So, well, just because you didn't write in every page, it's still been useful, it's still been a valuable resource for you. So I think part of it is the pressure that we put on ourselves to think that there's only one good way. Like, I think I'm a really strategic person because I don't plan in a linear way, because I can look so much further ahead than other people. And that's better than being somebody who shows up and sort of doggedly does each week. I also come across people who they're really consistent, but their content isn't very good. And I think, well, I'd rather have some of the ADHD people make me laugh, like Camden ADHD, and I think did you have her on your
Mhm.
podcast? And they're often really quite inconsistent. You'll see loads of them for ages and then they'll go quiet for a bit, but their content's great, and that's the bit that matters. And I also think it's okay to, with whatever it is in life or business, to to do that. Like, if it works for you to be spontaneous and you can be spontaneous consistently, that's the bit, if that kind of makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I loved what you said in your when you're the re-release of your episode about your own diagnosis and your ADHD. Looking back, what has changed for you the most since your diagnosis is that self-acceptance and that sense of like no longer apologizing for the way you do things, but really kind of um not trying to change yourself for other people, but really finding the superpower in, I even though I hate
Mhm.
that word sometimes, but finding, really leaning in to what your strengths are and being able to kind of change that inner narrative. Because for me, that's absolutely been the biggest change for me, which is like, yeah, we spent our whole lives being told the way we do things is wrong. So I get it. We really, really have some terrible self-esteem. But the biggest change for me is to realize like what I am bringing to the table, and to not apologize for who I am, and to see the value in how I have been doing things. And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, i loved I loved the way you articulate it much better than I am articulating it right now.
I shared in this podcast episode, which was a update of the episode that I did about my ADHD diagnosis, that like with my team, I often used to feel like I was almost like apologizing. I was giving people work, like, and apologizing for, well, if you work with me, I'm not the most organized person in the world, and like, don't expect me to have my content plan done, you know. And in the end, I was like, well, actually, there are other entrepreneurs that people could work for, and if you're the kind of person that it really winds you up, if somebody is a little bit more chaotic than the next person, there are other people that people can work with. And I've, like, for example, I've come to the point where I have my ops person who just tells me what I need to do, because we use Asana. We use this tool called Asana to help keep us organized. And I find it overwhelming because there's too many tasks. So I just get her to tell me what I need to do. And I feel a bit guilty, like I'm making everybody else use this tool, but actually it's my business and this is, this works for me. I shouldn't be feeling guilty about that, or thinking, well, if I'm making everybody else use Asana, then I should do it. I think that's part of the kind of cycle you can get into, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, another entire episode could be dedicated to apologies and
Yeah.
and how much we apologize for simply existing. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's another thing I kind of have to go through with my emails too. Like, am I apologizing for something that I really should be apologizing for, or am I just apologizing for existing? And I have to go through and
Mm.
edit that out, because I feel like our tendency is to be like, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. And it's like, that used to bother me so much with coworkers who would start an email with, I'm sorry to bother you. And I'm like, we work together. Your job is to bother me. Anyway,
Mm.
so I want to be mindful of the time. I feel like I still have so many questions. Am I keeping you? Do you have to go? Are you
No, it's
quickly
fine.
at
No,
noon? Okay. Or
my
sorry.
cat's just trying to get out of the window. That's all. But
Oh, okay. Um, Now, what another thing you said in your episode, which I will definitely have a link to because we've been talking about it a lot, was the how part of your ADHD is questioning your diagnosis all the time, which I
yeah.
laughed at when I heard that, because it is another common theme that we talk about a lot, and something I feel like I'm always reassuring people who reach out to me who are like terrified of when they go to the doctor for their diagnosis, right? Or, that constant minimizing of our symptoms and feeling like, well, maybe I am just a lazy person who's making excuses for myself, or maybe I am just frazzled, and feeling like that is such, I mean, they might as well put it in the DSM. I feel like it's so common in terms of a symptom for so many of us, that feeling of like, is this even it? That if you're questioning it, it's probably a good sign that you have it.
Yeah, and since I published this podcast episode last summer about my own diagnosis, if I was on commission for the number of women who had reached out to me and said that they've since been diagnosed, now, while I'm really happy for them, every time, I haven't admitted this before aloud, but every time I get one, I think, well, if everyone else has got it, like, maybe there's just psychotherapists out there who are just diagnosing people just to make money, and maybe none of us have got it. And because part of me is just like, having felt so different all of my life, I can't get my head around how other people could feel so different. And and then I think, well, does everybody else feel different underneath it really? And are we just thinking we're special different and all of this stuff going on? And it's hard.
Oh, I feel like I'm asking that question all the time. Especially with the pandemic. And it's the same concept when you buy a car, you see that car everywhere you go, all of a sudden it seems like that's the most common car. So it's the same thing with the pandemic diagnoses, right? I sort of feel like, has there been a proliferation of diagnoses? Is this actually ADHD, or is this just sort of symptoms that look like ADHD because we're all living through this collective trauma? And there's so many times where I think to myself, like, I don't think this is ADHD. I think you're just a feminist who needs to go for a run, and you've just been living under, since post-Trump America, and like, you're just like, look at the news, of course you're angry all the time, like, I'm always questioning it. And again, the same thing, which is like, I had somebody, was diagnosed by my psychiatrist. I was diagnosed by my doctor. I have this podcast. It's all I talk about or think about. And yet there is a part of me that's like, is this even it? Or is this something else? And I think it's sort of an evolving conversation, right? Which is like, when we talk about ADHD, are we talking about this neurodivergency? Or are we talking about a collection of traits that are being exhibited for a number of different reasons?
Yeah,
And yeah.
I found myself saying to somebody, we're working with an agency for ads at the moment, and I said to him, I feel like they're almost like going the other way now. Like, oh, we need to really be really sympathetic to you because you find it difficult when we give you too many things to do at once. Like, how would you like us to communicate with you? But I said to him, like, I know it. Afterwards I thought I shouldn't have said that. I know it sounds like an excuse, but I have got ADHD, so when people send me a brief that's like really, really detailed and it's got so many parts to it, it's actually really quite hard for me to kind of, and then I have to then very painfully pick it apart to give it to other people. So here's some things that are a bit better for me. And even we had a conversation about how they'd said that my invoice was overdue and it wasn't, and I was getting quite like upset about it, and that's I was getting quite upset about it because I was like, I don't want you to say if my invoice is overdue, because I've had plenty of those because I forgot to pay them, but in this case it isn't, and you're saying it is. And but I think that I found myself kind of almost apologizing. And I said, oh, I know it sounds like a bit of an excuse. And he was like, oh, no, no, no. And then I thought, why did I say that? Like, why did I say, I know this sounds like a bit of an excuse, but it's because that's what you hear. I had a friend of mine who's a teacher who I mentioned it to him, and he just said exactly what my dad said, which was like, oh, well, I haven't seen you throwing yourself around or, bouncing around or whatever, or you're not hyperactive. And I think part of it, there still is quite a bit of stigma, I think, isn't there, around it. And yeah, it's a really difficult one, but yeah, every day I'm like, I've just made this up.
Mhm.
I'm just making excuses for how I am.
I've stopped talking about ADHD with pretty much anyone but my podcast guests and my husband, because it is, yeah, it's so difficult to think about what associations other people have with the term ADHD. Which is
Yeah,
a
yeah.
great segue into my question: if you could name ADHD something else, what would you call it?
Well, actually, that picks up on something we talked about earlier. So I noticed when I went back to my podcast episode, I talked about it as a disorder,
Mhm.
and and I and I didn't notice it when I listened to it back. And then when I listened to it back, once I published it again, I was like, oh, I don't like that. I shouldn't have said it was a disorder. And when I wrote the show notes, I put condition. I'm not even sure if that's right. But actually, the mental health thing, which is really quite an interesting thing. So my podcast show notes lady said to me, I've put the categories mental health, something and something. And I I almost feel like, because for me it feels like a brain difference, and it feels quite different to something like depression or anxiety. It feels like it to me, and even I've always considered it as a difference in somebody's brain. And although, as far as I understand it, things like depression and anxiety are um, often come hand in hand, and things like bipolar, um, but it feels to me like it starts with a difference in the brain. So that's something that I But then I kind of find myself thinking, so isn't that, why does that get to you so much? Like, why do you want people to talk about it as a difference rather than a? So there are a couple of things. So, I was calling it a disorder, and I don't think I should be calling it a disorder. For me, it does feel it's just a difference. It's a difference in somebody's brain. But yeah, how does that sound to you?
No, absolutely. I think I completely agree in terms of, and I think this goes back to what I was saying about the symptoms that you exhibit as a result of the neurodivergency. Like, when you're talking about ADHD, what are we actually even talking about? Because, I think, yeah, I liken it a lot to being left-handed. And so this idea
Yeah.
that, when you are left-handed and somebody hands you right-handed scissors and then they admonish you for not being able to cut properly, and you don't know what's wrong with you and why is everybody else able to cut and you can't? Or you're sitting
Mm,
at a desk and why is everybody so comfortable in their desk and you feel really uncomfortable because this desk is not made for you, but you don't realize that left-handed scissors exist.
mm,
And so a lot of the symptoms that are coming about into adulthood, like depression and anxiety and these sort of comorbidities that, and even the term comorbidity, find is
yeah.
problematic because it makes it seem like it's coexisting, and when it's not, it's actually
Mm,
the result of a life undiagnosed. And so if you had lived your entire life with the proper accommodations, this wouldn't be a disorder. This wouldn't even be an issue, right? It's just, and
mm,
so I think it is so important in terms of the narrative about like what accommodations do children need, that then you can talk about, um, opening up classrooms to more neurodivergent
mm.
co- concepts and accommodations. And so I think, yeah, like I lost my train of thought, but basically the idea that, yeah, I think it's really what it comes down to is we all start out with a different brain,
Mm,
and then you, as we go on in life, you start to see the differences in terms of how our environment treats us in terms of our schooling or our home life, and the way in which, being the good kid and the anxiety that comes from that, all of the ways in which our environment shapes who we are, so that by the
mm.
time we get to adulthood, we're like, what is wrong with us? I can't do anything.
Yeah.
And you just needed the right scissors.
Yeah, and I feel like because I've got in my family, we've got quite a few children in the family who are on the autistic spectrum, and I feel, and this is just my personal experience. I'm not. This is just how I've experienced it, but I feel like there's more understanding there, a growing understanding of that as a difference and the accommodations that might be needed. Whereas ADHD is still kind of seen as this. I'm not saying that if you have a child with autism that you have it easy, because not at all, but I feel like there is my experience is a growing acceptance of the accommodations and trying to understand it, whereas I feel with ADHD it's still seen a little bit like that crazy kind of crazy Ritalin, like
I was
there's
just
there's
gonna
yeah, that's the difference that I see, I think.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, I think it's the pathologizing because of the medication aspect. And I am not anti medication by any means, but I do think when you get into a cycle of this is your disorder and here is the medication you need to treat it, there's an assumption that medication is the only way to manage. And that's how it sort of becomes pathologized and thought of as a disease. And
Mm,
I know medication is incredibly helpful, but at the same time, like if we started from scratch with environments that accommodate these brain types, then we wouldn't need to get to the point where or maybe we would, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a professional,
mhm.
I'm just a question asker and a seeker. But again, I sort of feel like there's this, we treat it like a disease, in so many ways along the journey, in terms of the diagnosis and then the medication and everything, where I'm like, this is not a blood pressure issue.
Yeah.
This is not a cholesterol issue that requires medication. This is something entirely different. So anyway,
Mm.
I feel like I could go on and on and on. And I really do want to talk about courageous content because it's such an incredible program. And unfortunately, this episode is not going to be out in time for your November workshop, but I think I'm going to attend it
Oh, cool.
because I'm just in love with what you're doing. And I love the idea of a calendar. And but in terms of when this podcast comes out, it will come out before the end of the year, so we can still talk about the content calendar in terms of,
Mhm.
what it offers. And
Yeah, I'm very impressed that you're that far ahead with your podcast. That's very good. Um, yeah, so I've had a bit of a rebrand this year. So my planner has been called different things. So it started off as a media diary, then it was a social media diary. And that's one thing actually I think ADHD is really good for. Like I don't overthink these things. I just create them and then I fix it afterwards. But it was actually a few years ago that um I was actually interviewing some of my own podcast who was a branding expert, and she turned the tables on me and she started to say to me, well, what is it that you actually do? She said, you don't help people create content, you help people be more courageous in their content, and you help people to show up, because showing up online, when you really dig down to the problems people have with consistency and showing up, often it isn't just about time, it's about not knowing what to post, it's about feeling that our ideas are silly, it might be about being afraid of being on video, afraid of being judged, afraid of having opinions. When people are publishing dull as dishwater content, it's often because they're just so afraid of what people will think and being judged, and people who often don't matter that much.
or
So
also putting something out there and getting no response, and then the
yes,
rejection
yeah.
from that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The rejection of putting content out that nobody responds to. And and actually what's really interesting, so I often ask people to think about their own personal Facebook, for example, and what they post on their personal Facebook and what gets great engagement. And somehow when people have a business or they have to create content for a business, somehow they just become really boring, when actually we're all quite entertaining and know how to share engaging content, or certainly know what it looks like from our personal social media content. So I had this kind of going around my brain for a few years, this courageous content thing, but I couldn't quite think how it all came together. And then, this is quite ADHD, but I'd had this podcast for 450 episodes and I couldn't put my finger on it. It was like one of the UK's top marketing podcasts. It was doing really well, but I felt like I could do better. So I was just like, it's not that I'm not enjoying it anymore. It's not that I'm not enjoying the interviews, or I don't know what it is. And so I was sat there one day and I was like, and then I thought, oh, actually, I don't have to do this anymore, do I? I can just end it now. So I rang my friend and said, do you think I should end my podcast? And she said, yeah. And so that was that. So I decided to park it. And actually, my podcast editor said to me, I think you're making a big mistake. Like, I think your podcast is really popular. Why would you do that? But I just knew it. I felt I could do better. So I took a break and I rebranded and came out with this courageous content podcast. I knew what I wanted it to be about. I didn't know how the rest of it all fitted in, but I just did it anyway, which is what I always do. And I just had this sense that I wanted to go back to creating content that was more sort of back to my journalism days, so doing interviewing people who were creating courageous content for different reasons, and shorter episodes, more, not more edgy, but more kind of challenging some of the topics or whatever. I felt like I got very into that kind of like, oh, let's just interview another expert in this or that, and actually challenging myself to be more courageous in the people I was asking to interview. So I launched the podcast and then I ended up rebranding everything else. Just suddenly everything just fell into place. So it's the Courageous Content Planner, and it has this planning system, which we talked about, the 4x4 strategy, which is really just a kind of a sort of structure to kind of anchor, really just to kind of get you into that consistency. And we have this event every year, Courageous Content Live this year, virtual content planning event. And what we do, and this is probably a big thing for ADHDers, is it's about accountability. So we show up, we don't just create the plan. This year we're creating 80 social media posts as well, with other people around you, so you've got that accountability and you can't make excuses. But it is all recorded and you can buy the virtual ticket after it's happened. So if you're listening to this, whenever, you can still buy it. And then
Oh, okay, good to know.
this has led into I also decided I'd had this online membership which had about 500 members, and I just kind of, again, I felt like I was doing too much. I felt like I had too much on my plate. So I just decided to draw a line under that as well. So that took a little bit of figuring out. And so we've started this a new membership called the Curators Club, which is a content planning membership. And it really is about some of the things that I've done in my business the last year or so have been so inspired by ADHD. So we have get it done sessions. So in my membership, we have accountability sessions. co-working sessions. We have a weekly Get It Plan session where you can come and plan your content with other people for the next week. We have a monthly Get Inspired. And so it's about providing that structure, the framework, putting it on your calendar. And I think for people who struggle with consistency, often it is just about, we had an appointment today to create this piece of content together. So unless something came up, we were both going to show up and do it. And I think a lot of being consistent is about that. So this membership has totally grown out of it's a content planning membership, which is about not only providing inspiration but also just giving you that accountability to show up. So I hope that's not too long and in depth for people who don't have a business, but
No, I
yeah.
love that. I remember when it occurred to me, you go to the dentist every 6 months, and at the end of your dentist appointment, you make your next appointment. And it occurred to me, I was like, why don't I do that more often with other things? And so it was the same with like when I go out for a walk with a friend, we make sure that we set up the next walk at the end of that walk. Otherwise, life gets away
Yeah.
from you and you forget about it. And so I like try to do that in other elements of my life too. So I love co-working and yeah. I love that. So now how, if somebody wants to join it, they just go to your website?
So if you go to my website, which is janetmurray.co.uk, so by the time this goes live, it should be open. And the Curators Club, it's about the philosophy is showing up and being consistent with content without having to have all the answers, like, without having to have it all figured out, without knowing what the end of the story is. It's just, let's just be brave, let's just turn up, let's do the content, let's just put it, and let's just get better as we go along. Let's not, let perfectionism get in the way. So that's really what it's all about. There's monthly classes as well and challenges and things to take part in, but a lot of it is about consistency, accountability, community, because like you say, when you make that appointment with your friend for the next week, you tend to show up, don't you? Or the next walk or whatever, you tend to show up. So yeah, it's janetmurray.co.uk, and you'll find it all there.
Amazing. Awesome. Um, well, thank you so much. I thank you for your time today. And I was so pleased when you reached out. So thank you for
Well,
sharing
thanks
more
for
about
having
your own
me.
story.
An avid listener, so it's always nice to be interviewed for a podcast that you listen to. So that's really nice.